Good morning and welcome to my presentation. My name is Kyle Smith and I'm CEO of HR Kyle Services, where uh, whether that be businesses or individuals, navigating this thing called the world of work. So I'm very happy to have you join us here today. Today we'll be talking about preparing for job interviews, how to answer questions and communicate value. A little bit about me first. I spent over 25 years in corporate HR, most of that time holding the top HR role in my organizations. Needless to say, I've interviewed hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of job candidates and hired more than a few of them. I've interviewed candidates for all levels of job, from entry level to president of the company, and I've led these hiring efforts in all of my different organizations. If you would like to connect with me offline, I've included QR codes to provide you all of my contact information, as well as a QR code to connect with me through my company website. I'd also like to point you to resources that I make available through my organization. You can easily find us on most social media platforms by simply searching for HR Kyle. We also host a weekly podcast, the HR Kyle podcast, that's available on most podcasting platforms. Each week, we publish a weekly blog called the Workplace Work Path Weekly via our website. And we also host an online radio station called WorkSphere Radio. All of these sources and resources are wonderful places for you to get additional information to assist you in your job search and your career success. But today, let's talk about preparing for job interviews, how to answer questions and communicate value. And I always like to start this discussion off with a key point, and that is there are two goals for you for every interview. One, help the person imagine you in the job. Number two, help the person imagine you as a coworker. Please allow these two goals to guide you throughout your process of applying for jobs, interviewing for jobs, and all the follow up that's necessary afterwards. If you follow these two goals, you'll find that you'll have a great deal of success in your job search process. So, today we're talking about communicating value. And ultimately, the way you communicate value is how you respond to interview questions. So, that's going to be our focus for today. Why is this so important? Because the competition's stiff. Let's take a look at some numbers briefly. The typical job will have anywhere from 50 to 200 applicants apply for that job. That doesn't seem to matter if that's a local job, a regional job, a remote position, in person, or something that's posted on a national basis. It is very common for us as HR professionals, as hiring managers, to receive anywhere from 50 to 200 applicants, regardless of the job type or job title. Most often, we're interviewing anywhere from 3 to 5 people for the one job, possibly more, but at least we know there's going to be 3 to 5 people that you, as the candidate, are competing against. And from our standpoint, if we've reached a point of calling you in for an interview, most often we find that every candidate tends to look pretty much the same or similar as far as their experience, their background, and education. And again, this is how they look on paper. This also demonstrates to you why this is so important to focus on what sets you apart, because that's ultimately the question that we're looking for as HR professionals and in hiring managers in the interview. What sets you, candidate, apart from the other 3 to 5 people that I'm interviewing for this same exact position? And this is where communicating your value comes into play. So let's talk about what I consider the 3 key areas of an interview. And we're going to break these down one by one throughout this discussion today. And we'll talk about how in each one of these areas you demonstrate and communicate your value. The first area is the introduction. So this is where you're meeting the hiring team or the individual that you're going to be interviewing with. This starts with a handshake. This starts with exchanging names. They give you your name, you give them yours. There's an exchange of business cards. Please make sure that you're getting business cards from each person that you're interviewing with, and we'll talk about that more in a moment. The person or persons are also sharing their titles and their roles in an organization. And this step also talks about the first question you're going to get asked. Tell me or tell us about yourself. And I'll go into more detail on that in a moment. The second area is the middle. So these are the bulk of the interview questions you're going to be asked. These are your responses. This is where you and the interviewer or interviewers are note taking. They're taking notes about what is happening in the interview or things that you want to remember. The third part is the close. This is where you're asking your questions, you're discussing next steps with the hiring team. There is the handshake again, and there's also a thank you. And I'm going to go into more detail again in each one of these key areas. So let's talk about introduction first. Let's talk about the handshake. Please don't dismiss the value of an effective handshake at the beginning of an interview. Make sure it's a firm, but not too firm. Make sure that you have eye contact with the person that you're shaking hands with. Make sure that you also say thank you, Mr. Jones, or thank you, Steve, for this interview today. That thank you as part of that handshake goes a long way. And also, one key reminder, always be sure that you're standing when you're shaking someone's hand. It is considered disrespectful in the United States to shake someone's hand while sitting. Be sure, as I mentioned earlier, that you collect business cards. And here's why. One, this allows you to use the person's name during the interview. People love to hear their names. It also allows you to make more of a personal connection with the person that you're interviewing with. Also, the business cards make it easier for you to send thank you notes after the interview. So these business cards are critical to get at the beginning of your interview. And if you're not offered one, ask for business cards from the individuals in the room. If they're not able to give you one, this is where your note taking comes in handy. Write down the person or person's names and their role in the organization on your notepad so that you can remember it. Now, as part of this introduction, there's also the first critical question that you're going to be asked, and we're going to talk about this in detail. Tell us about yourself. So tell us about yourself. First critical question. Here's what everyone would like to hear. I'm going to make sure that everyone sees the slides that we're working through here today. Here's what the individual wants to hear in the interview. Your name, your education, training directly related to the job. So if it's training that you've received that's not directly related, please don't include it in your about me or tell me about yourself. They also want to hear a summary, however, brief of your prior role or roles, again, as they relate to this job. Why the job is of interest to you, again, be brief on this, but also talk about why it's of interest to you related to them, not to you. In other words, don't say, I'm interested in this job because it'll pay me a lot of money, or I'm interested in this job because it will help me to have a job because I'm out of work right now. Let them know that you're interested in the job because, for example, it allows you to utilize skills that you've gained over your professional career. Or you're interested in this job because you see a strong match between the skills and duties and responsibilities that you've done in the past and what the job requires. And then also, as part of what we want to hear and tell me about yourself, where can you add value? And again, you're referring to something about the organization or more specifically about the job. And I put a keynote here at the bottom. Please make sure these tell me about yourself are no longer than 45 seconds to a minute. If it goes beyond about a minute, I can assure you the interviewer is going to get bored. They're going to get distracted. We're expecting a response that's relatively brief to cover these points. Remember, this response sets the tone for the remainder of the interview. So please practice, practice, practice. And we're going to talk about practice even more a little bit later in this presentation. So we're going to transition to the middle of the interview. This is the longest part. This is where you get the most questions. And by the way, in case you haven't noticed, you've already begun to communicate your value to that organization in your response to tell us about yourself. So you're already in this mode of communicating your value. Let's transition now to the middle part of the interview. Here are the typical questions that you can expect. Tell us about your strengths and weaknesses. Tell us about challenging situations that you've had. Talk about your interactions with teams. And these questions could be noted and worded in any different way. But the crux of it is this is what they're looking to gain. They want to understand your strengths and weaknesses. What type of challenging situations have you encountered? How do you work in a team? What do you bring to this role, or why should we hire you? You should always be able to answer that question. And then finally, they're probably going to want to know a little bit about your last job. What did you do? Why did you leave there? What was your experience? What was the process there? So again, understanding that these questions are going to be the typical questions to expect. And now let's talk about the best way to respond. It's something known as the STAR approach. Some of you listening today may have heard of the STAR approach before, but I highly encourage you, and again, we're going to get into detail what the STAR approach is, but I highly encourage you to answer all questions using the STAR approach. The only exception would be that first question. Tell us about yourself. Why do we like to ask questions and get a STAR approach as a response? Because it's based upon the principle that the best predictor of future performance is past performance in the same or similar situation. In other words, it's proof of what you can do. So again, that's how you're communicating value. So let's break down the STAR approach with all of the different letters. One, the S stands for situation. So you're setting the scene. You're providing that listener information on what is necessary to understand the story. One example would be at my previous job as a team lead in logistics company, we were facing delays in order processing during peak season. Then we move to the task part of the response. This is your challenge, duty, or objective. What was expected? So following along in this same example, I was tasked with identifying the bottleneck and improving turnaround time without adding extra labor costs. So that's your task, what you were tasked with. The A in STAR is action. These are the steps you took, your contributions, and keep that in mind. Even if you were a team lead, we want to understand what were your contributions in the situation and be as specific as possible. So here's our example. I reviewed the entire process, mapped out inefficiencies, and proposed a structured shift handoff system. I also trained team members on the new workflow. So again, even in this situation where the person took more of a leadership role, they're still demonstrating the action that they took. And now let's talk about the R. And I separate this from the other three because too often when I'm in interviews and I hear people even using the STAR approach, they tend to either miss the R entirely or they underemphasize it. Please don't be one of those people. The R is just as critical as the other three letters. In fact, it might be more critical. So the R is the result. So you're talking about what happened, the outcome. You want to try to quantify it if possible. And if it wasn't a perfect outcome or a perfect result, show what you learned. What would you do differently in that same situation? So here's a typical R response that follows along the other STA. So within 2 weeks, order processing improved by 27%. So there's your quantifying it. Customer complaints dropped. Again, quantifying the results. And the team met all delivery targets for the quarter. Again, quantified all the outcomes here that took place as a result of the situation, task, and action that this person took. And again, this tells me that this person, if placed in the same or a similar situation that exists in the job, if they're working for us, more than likely they would undertake a very similar or the same process to solve that issue. So, again, this past performance is a wonderful predictor of what will happen in the future if that person's in the same or similar situation. This is the value of using stories. The other thing to remember with stories is we as humans love stories. It's very easy for us to follow. We're drawn into those. This is why so many of the television programs that we follow and that we're interested in, they also, by and large, follow a star approach. They give you the situation, the task or what's happening or what needs to happen, the action that the individuals took, and then the results. So this is a wonderful framework to bring to the interview situation, again, to answer questions in order to communicate your value. So let's talk about value. What is value? It's not just experience, it's impact. And again, this is why I've stressed so much on why that R is important. Your impact, just like the drop of water there in that picture, look at the impact of that one drop of water and all the waves that's created. Well, that's your value in an organization. So you're quantifying it to show your results that where you save time, you increased revenue, you improved service, you reduced errors, some way that the steps that you took had a positive impact on the situation, the work group, the shift, the circumstance, the organization, all of those things. So as you're preparing your responses for those common questions that I mentioned earlier, always consider what was the impact of the action that you took, because that is ultimately where you're communicating your value. We've talked about the beginning, we've talked about the middle, but please let's not overlook the close of the interview as well. And I put on here, close strong, because we as interviewers, we're as much focusing on how the interview ends as how it began and how it progressed. So you definitely want to close strongly. Close the deal. So think of this as a sales call, in other words. So in the close, you're asking your questions. You're talking about and learning about next steps. You're making sure that handshake is happening. And I described what that should look like earlier, right? It's looking the person in the eye, a nice firm handshake, thanking them for the interview today. Be sure that you're doing all those things. Those are the little things that so often set you apart in interview situations. So your questions, make sure that your questions aren't questions that could have been answered by doing a little bit of research. Make sure that your questions aren't those typical off the shelf questions. Tell me about a typical day. What is your culture like? What's it take to get ahead here? Those are the questions that we get asked so often in interviews. And quite frankly, we see that as a lack of effort on the interviewee's part. So you want to ask questions that are going to help you make a decision on whether this employer is one that you would like to work with and work for. It's going to inform your decision making on this process, because remember, an interview is as much about you selling yourself and you being able to make a decision as it is the other side understanding who you are and what value you can add. So please work to understand, why should I work for this employer? So that's where your questions are coming from. And again, make sure that they're not ones that you could have done research on and found out yourself. Learn about the next steps. And when I talk about next steps, I'm meaning what's going to happen on the company side after this interview. Are they going to regroup? Are they interviewing more candidates? When can you expect to hear back? Is there a follow-up protocol that you should follow? Find out about all of those next steps that they're going to entertain and undertake. That will help inform the actions that you need to take next. And then I list here at the bottom a key question that you must ask. And I've shrunk it down a little bit here to make sure that it fits on the screen. But the key question that you must ask at the end of each interview is there anything that we've talked about today or in my background that would make you not consider me further for the role that we've talked about today? And once you ask that question, stop. Let the interviewer respond to that question. A couple of things are going to happen. One, they may well say, no, there isn't anything. Or they may say something. Well, the one thing that concerns me is you've never worked in this kind of environment. Or the one thing that concerns me is you lack experience in this particular area. When they give you that information, please take the time to respond to what they've said. And another piece of advice, please don't respond with, well, I'm a quick learner, or oh, I'm sure I'll figure that out, or something that's just, again, an off the shelf answer. Take the time to understand their concern and respond to it in a way that dispels their concern. So, for example, if they say, well, I'm concerned that you've never worked in this kind of environment before, you can say, I appreciate that concern. However, if you notice in my past 3 roles, I've gone into environments that I hadn't worked in before. And over a short period of time, I proved my worth to the organization. I was promoted, whatever happened. So, again, taking that STAR approach in a lot of ways here again, you're giving them the situation, the task, the action, the result, condensed down. Again, to respond to their objection that they provided to you. This allows you to leave the interview with much more confidence on your standing in the process. And again, if they say no, there wasn't anything, then certainly thank them for that feedback and that you look forward to being considered further then in light of that, and stay positive throughout the interaction. So after the interview, how do you demonstrate value? You can also demonstrate it, and you will and you should, after the interview. You're sending thank you emails within a few hours. Because remember, one of our goals, they want to imagine you as a coworker. So part of imagining you as a coworker is that someone that appreciates other people's time and they respect their time and they're appreciative of things that people do for them. That's a really good coworker. Be sure to send it to everyone that you interviewed with. Also, make sure that it's a high impact follow-up. And what I mean there is during the interview, you've been taking notes about things that were talked about or challenges that they had or issues that came up and so on. Send your follow-up and reference the things that they mentioned. So if they said, well, one of our issues is, we're finding that that our workforce doesn't get here on time. Well, in your follow-up, you mentioned something about how important being on time is. And if you're a team leader, that's something that you will stress with your team and that's something that you will work on and you will develop. In other words, make sure that follow-up, again, is demonstrating the value and communicating the value that you will add if hired. And also connect with the person on LinkedIn if you can. If you have a LinkedIn profile, and by the way, I highly encourage everyone listening to have a LinkedIn profile, and look for those individuals that you interviewed with on LinkedIn and connect with them. Why is that important? Because again, it demonstrates that you're a person that wants to connect and you want to be a part of that team and you want to know them. In other words, you're communicating your value, that you see this as more than just a transaction, that this is something that you want to be a part of and contribute to. So again, you're communicating your value. And then finally, follow up if you haven't heard back. If they've given you an idea that, oh, we should have an answer for you in a week, and it's a week later and you haven't heard anything, it's okay to give them a call or send an email and say, just want to follow up. I know there was going to be a decision made in a week. Just want to stress the fact that I'm still very interested in this position. If there's any questions that you may have, please let me know. Again, you're communicating your value with someone that it follows up. that listens and takes the initiative. Those are all ways that you're communicating your value and the actions that you're taking after the interview. So, how do we make all this happen? I've given you a lot of information today. We've talked about a lot of things. There's, this whole idea of communicating value and so on, and that's the way to really stand out in the interview and answer the questions and so on. Well, let's talk about that. Preparation is critical. And I alluded to this throughout the presentation today, but I want to hit on it here with this slide. One, be sure that before you go to the interview, you study the job posting. Understand the things that are critical to the role that they've listed in that job description that you have to know how to do and be proficient at. Understand the requirements that they think are relevant to this role to be successful. Study the company. Remember, I said earlier, don't ask any questions that you could have found out yourself. Well, study the company, find out where their other locations are if they have other locations, find out what their values and their mission and their vision are. Find out maybe who their important customers and their clients are. Find out the things that they're doing in the community. There's a lot of information, and we're fortunate in this day and age that we have these things called cell phones and we have the internet. Research is so much easier than it was many, many years ago because literally the answers can be right in your hand. But make sure that you do that research because me as the hiring manager, interviewer, it it's a very positive feeling for me when I have a candidate who's sitting across from me who brings up something that they've read online or that they've studied about or they understand about our company because they're already demonstrating, again, the value that they bring, that they will do research, that they want to understand who we are and the customers that we serve and so on. Again, here's another way that your preparation and voicing that during the interviews and during the follow up is communicating your value. You're not the kind of person that just sits back and waits for the organization to provide you information. You're taking the initiative. And as I mentioned so many times, practice your responses to the common questions. And I gave you the common questions earlier. So please reflect on those. For each one of those common questions, practice answering with the STAR approach. If there's a question about, how do you typically handle challenging situations? Well, guess what, Mr. Interviewer, I'm so glad you asked that question. I had one of these situations come up recently and then you go right into that STAR approach, the situation, the task, the action, the result. And be sure to, and this is why I broke the interview down into the 3 stages, work through what your introduction looks like, that introductory phase, and how you answer that first question. Tell us about yourself. Then go into the middle section where you have the common questions that are asked and how you're going back and forth and how that interchange happens and you're demonstrating your value and communicating it there. And then finally, practice to close. What does your close look like? What questions are you asking? How are you leaving that interview? How are you responding to that question when they say there's something in your background that's concerning, or there's something about your experience? Be prepared to ask those questions because if you've studied the job posting, more than likely you can ascertain something about your background that may fall a little bit short compared to what they're looking for. So you can prepare for that question at the end where they say, well, we would hire you except there's this one thing. But again, work through each one of those stages, practice your response and how you would flow through that to make sure you make the best impression. Because again, the more you prepare, the more it's going to come out in the interview. Because the other thing that we look for in interviews, and when you talk about communicating value, is someone that comes in prepared and confident to be an active participant in an interview. Because from the business perspective, this interview is another meeting that we have. So how is this candidate that I'm meeting with, how are they going to conduct themselves in meetings? Your preparation, again, communicates the value that you're going to bring. So here's some key takeaways that I'd like you to focus on today. One, value is your potential impact. So the value that you bring, we talk about communicating your value. The value you bring is the potential impact that you're going to make to the role and to the organization and to the team. Potential impact is best provided or spoken to talking about past impact. So, what are situations in the past to where you were challenged, or you had a difficult situation, or there was a difficult coworker, or you needed to get something done in a short period of time? So, by telling those stories that where these things happened in the past, you're demonstrating and communicating your value of how you would handle them in the future. And when we talk about past impact, the best way to do that is tell a story. People love stories. Humans love stories. It's easy for us to follow. It's easy for us to be interested in that. We remember those and so on. And then, what's the best way to tell a story? Well, gosh, we talked about that, right? It's the STAR approach: the situation, task, the action, result. Tell your story and formulate it following that format. And again, you're following it step by step. So you're not bouncing around. You talk about the STAR first, then you move to the you move to start with the S first, then you move to the T, you move to the A, and then you move to the R. And the STAR approach, well, let's just make it easy here. For every one of the questions you get asked, other than tell me about yourself, you're answering with that same STAR approach. So you're telling stories for every single question that you get asked, no matter how that question is worded. Have you ever worked with Excel before? Well, yes, I have. And let me tell you about how I use Excel. And then you get into a story. So every response to a question you're asked follows the STAR approach. And the other thing that I want to have you take away is the small details. So often, candidates get a position over their competition because of the small details they follow. And these are things such as handling that handshake correctly at the beginning, excuse me, and at the end. The firm handshake, the look in the eye, the thank you for your time, using the person's name. Those are small details. The follow up thank you after the interview, the follow up thank you that has your value that you can bring, that references things that came up in the interview that you will bring to this next role, or things that came up that you want to make sure that you reiterate. Those small details are so often how you set yourself apart from quote unquote the other competition that are being interviewed for the position. So don't underestimate the value of focusing on those small details. Want to reiterate again that I have plenty of resources that are online that I'd love to see you take advantage of relative to your job searching, your interviewing, preparing for those interviews, being really good at giving STAR responses and so on. I certainly want to thank you for tuning in today and listening. I've listed my contact information there as well. I'd love to connect with you on LinkedIn. There's our website. Also, if you'd like to reach out and talk with us, there's our phone number there listed as well. These resources that I list here up to and including my LinkedIn are very important because, again, I'm providing you information on how to answer interview questions and how to prepare for job interviews and how to communicate your value. And these are all free resources that we offer through these channels here. So I encourage you to take advantage of those. On top of that, we're very immigrant friendly, and I think that's important, especially in this day and age where I know some of you are concerned with that. We work with a large number of individuals who have either relocated to the U.S. currently or have done at some point in their careers. Their immigration status is in all ranges that you can imagine, from U.S. citizenship to we work with students or here on student visas as well, and everything in between. So we're very immigrant friendly. We're also very conscious of the challenges that immigrants face. So you'll see that come out in the content that we produce, as well as your interactions with us, because obviously, as we all know, there are some unique challenges that immigrants face that others in the job market do not. So we're very friendly to that. We're very aware of that. And quite frankly, we love helping in that area. Other than that, I want to thank you for tuning in today. I hope you found this presentation, this talk, as valuable as it possibly could be. Otherwise, take care, and I look forward to talking with you all and seeing you soon.